The year was 1944, and across the war-torn European landscape, the momentum had shifted decisively against Nazi Germany. From the beaches of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, American forces pushed eastward, leaving in their wake not just victory, but thousands of wounded German soldiers, many of them officers who had been taught to expect the worst if captured by Allied forces. As American units advanced through France and into Germany, they encountered increasing numbers of wounded enemy personnel. These German officers, products of rigorous military academies and steeped in Nazi propaganda, had been conditioned to believe that surrender meant brutality or death. Many chose to fight to the end rather than face capture. Others, incapacitated by their wounds, had no choice but to surrender to the approaching Americans. The battlefield collection points were chaotic scenes of triage and urgent medical attention. Here, American medics made the first critical decisions that would save lives, both Allied and enemy. Contrary to the expectations of many German officers, the treatment protocols were remarkably similar regardless of the uniform the wounded man wore. Initial stabilization, morphine for pain, plasma for blood loss. The immediate medical response focused on preserving life rather than distinguishing friend from foe. We were taught that Americans would execute officers on sight, recalled Hauptmann Werner Kleinschmidt in a post-war interview. When I was wounded outside St. Lo, I tried to remove my insignia. I expected to be shot. Instead, I received a cigarette, a shot of morphine, and was loaded onto the same evacuation truck as American wounded. This reality contradicted years of carefully crafted propaganda. The Nazi leadership had specifically warned officers that enemy forces would single them out for harsh treatment, creating a powerful incentive to resist capture at all costs. Some carried suicide pills, while others received explicit orders to fight until death rather than surrender. You know, it's moments like these in history that remind us how humanity can sometimes prevail, even in the darkest hours. If you're enjoying this journey through Weitu's Untold medical stories, please consider subscribing to our channel. We'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop us a comment below. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable historical accounts to light. Once wounded German officers were stabilized at forward aid stations, they entered the American medical evacuation chain, a sophisticated system designed to move casualties from the front lines to appropriate treatment facilities. The evacuation process itself could be grueling. Ambulances navigated bomb-cratered roads, sometimes traveling for hours over difficult terrain. German officer patients, already in physical agony, endured these journeys with the added psychological burden of uncertainty about their final destination. The American military police carefully segregated officer POWs from enlisted personnel, following established protocols for processing enemy prisoners. German officers were systematically searched for weapons, documents of military value, and any means of self-harm. Their personal items were inventoried, their wounds documented, and their identities verified against available intelligence. Captain James Holcomb, who served as a processing officer at a collection point near Aachen in late 1944, noted, "The German officers arrived expecting interrogation under duress. Many seemed prepared to provide only name, rank, and serial number. When they realized they would receive the same medical attention as our own men, their demeanor often changed dramatically." The reality of American medical treatment represented a profound psychological shock for many German officers. They had been conditioned to view Americans as vengeful and undisciplined. Instead, they encountered a methodical, professional system guided by military regulations and medical ethics. Transportation to rear area military hospitals presented its own challenges. Medical train cars, converted trucks, and occasionally aircraft moved the most seriously wounded German officers alongside American casualties. Security concerns meant that enemy wounded were under guard at all times. But the guard's primary role was increasingly protective rather than punitive. The journey from frontline to military hospital could take several days, during which time German officers began to process their new reality. Some remained suspicious and withdrawn, convinced that proper treatment was merely a prelude to interrogation. Others, particularly those who had received emergency surgery or blood transfusions, began to recognize that their care was genuinely medical rather than tactical in nature. By the time these wounded German officers reached permanent military hospitals in France, Belgium, or increasingly within liberated areas of Germany itself, many had begun to adjust their expectations. The Nazi propaganda that had shaped their worldview was being dismantled not through counter-arguments, but through direct experience. The American military hospital system that awaited them was stretched thin by the demands of caring for thousands of Allied casualties, yet it maintained a remarkable commitment to treating all wounded according to medical need rather than national allegiance. It was here that these German officers would encounter another unexpected aspect of American military culture: the Red Cross nurses, who would view them not as Nazi officers, but simply as wounded men in need of care. As ambulances and medical transport vehicles arrived at these hospitals, the wounded Germans passed from the battlefield evacuation system into a world of white beds, antiseptic smells, and the distinctive uniforms of the Army Nurse Corps and Red Cross. It was a transition that would challenge fundamental assumptions on both sides of the conflict and reveal dimensions of humanity that war had failed to extinguish. As the reality of captivity settled in for wounded German officers, they faced a journey into a medical system unlike anything their propaganda had prepared them for. By 1944, the American military had established an extensive network of field and evacuation hospitals across the European theater. These facilities operated with remarkable efficiency despite constant challenges: shifting front lines, supply shortages, and the overwhelming volume of casualties that could arrive without warning. The U.S. Army's medical infrastructure followed a carefully designed progression. Wounded POWs who survived initial field treatment would move through collection points, clearing stations, and finally to evacuation or general hospitals. These facilities ranged from canvas tent complexes near the front to more permanent installations in liberated territories, some housed in repurposed schools, hotels, or government buildings. At the heart of this system worked the American Red Cross nurses, whose presence often came as the first surprise to German officer patients. These women, typically in their 20s and 30s, had undergone rigorous training before deployment. Many held nursing degrees from prestigious American universities and had volunteered specifically for overseas duty. Their crisp uniforms with distinctive red crosses represented both professional authority and the humanitarian principles that transcended national boundaries. We were taught that once a wounded man entered our hospital, his uniform became irrelevant, recalled Lieutenant Anne Matheson, who served in a 400-bed evacuation hospital near Liège in 1944. The only thing that mattered was the nature of his wounds and how quickly we could stabilize him. This approach was grounded firmly in the Geneva Convention, which American medical personnel followed meticulously. Military nurses received specific instruction on the proper treatment of enemy wounded, emphasizing that medical care must be provided without discrimination. The American commitment to these principles wasn't merely idealistic. It represented a practical demonstration of the democratic values for which the nation claimed to be fighting. When German officers first arrived at American hospitals, the initial interactions often followed a predictable pattern. Many remained rigidly formal, offering only name, rank, and serial number while bracing for mistreatment that never materialized. The language barrier complicated matters. Though German-speaking American personnel were assigned when available, communication often relied on basic phrases, gestures, and medical terminology that crossed linguistic boundaries. We had one Hauptmann, a captain who arrived with extensive shrapnel wounds, remembered Captain Eleanor Roberts, who supervised a surgical ward in northern France. He refused to make eye contact for the first day, answering only in monosyllables. By the third day, he was asking about his treatment plan and complimenting our medical equipment. By the end of 2 weeks, he was helping translate for other German patients. These transitions from enemy to patient rarely happened overnight. Many German officers had been indoctrinated with years of propaganda about American decadence, inefficiency, and brutality. The discovery that American military medicine was both advanced and humanely administered often created cognitive dissonance. Some responded with suspicion, others with quiet reassessment of their preconceptions. The psychological shift was equally challenging for American medical personnel. Red Cross nurses had seen the devastating results of German military actions, from the injuries of American soldiers to the suffering of civilians in liberated territories. Many had brothers, husbands, or fiancés serving at the front. Maintaining professional detachment required extraordinary discipline. I remember changing dressings for a Luftwaffe officer while down the hall. 3 American boys from a shot-down B-17 were fighting for their lives, said Lieutenant Dorothy Hansen, who served in a hospital outside Paris. My hands did their job perfectly, but inside I was in turmoil. Then I looked down and realized that beneath those bandages, the wounds looked identical. Bodies don't know nationality. This perspective, seeing the wounded as men first, enemies second, became the foundation of American military medical ethics, yet it wasn't without controversy. Hospital administrators sometimes faced criticism from combat units or even other medical personnel who questioned the allocation of resources to enemy wounded while American casualties waited. Military regulations provided clear guidance. Triage was based on medical necessity, not uniform. This principle was generally maintained, though subtle differences in care inevitably emerged. American patients received more frequent visitors, better access to recreation and reading materials, and the psychological benefit of being among countrymen. German officers, despite receiving equivalent medical treatment, experienced the isolation of being surrounded by their former adversaries. The quality of American medical care frequently surprised German officer patients. The abundance of penicillin, blood plasma, and advanced surgical techniques stood in stark contrast to the increasingly desperate conditions in German military hospitals. American nurses noted that many German wounded were astonished by the ready availability of pain medication, fresh bandages, and specialized equipment. "They couldn't believe we changed dressings twice daily," remembered Captain Margaret Williams, who served at an evacuation hospital near Reims. A German medical officer told me their field hospitals were reusing bandages by the end of 1943. He said our medical supply system alone convinced him Germany had already lost the war. Cultural differences created both tensions and moments of unexpected connection. German officers, accustomed to military hierarchies and male authority, initially struggled with taking directions from female nurses. This adjustment revealed much about both societies. American nurses wielded professional authority that many German officers had never encountered in women, requiring adjustments to deeply ingrained attitudes. They were used to nurses as assistants, not decision-makers, explained Lieutenant Catherine Miller. "The first time I countermanded a German officer's attempt to remove his own IV, the look on his face was unforgettable. But they learned quickly that in my ward, medical authority trumped military rank, regardless of which army you served." The presence of German-speaking nurses or interpreters often transformed the hospital experience for wounded officers. Being able to express pain, ask questions about treatment, or simply engage in basic conversation provided psychological relief. These interactions, however limited by circumstance, created spaces where human connection occasionally transcended the broader conflict. As recovery progressed, many German officers began assisting hospital staff, translating for other patients, helping with minor ward duties, or participating in their own rehabilitation. These small collaborations sometimes evolved into more complex relationships marked by reluctant respect on both sides. Some American nurses reported receiving formal notes of thanks, hand-carved gifts, or technical drawings from engineering-trained officers. Despite these human connections, security remained a constant consideration. Wounded German officers were still prisoners of war. Guards were posted, movements restricted, and communications monitored. Medical personnel received regular reminders about the limits of appropriate interaction, intelligence concerns, and the prohibition against discussing military matters. The balance between security and medical care created situations unique to wartime. Recovery itself presented ethical questions. Every German officer returned to health potentially meant danger for American soldiers if prisoner exchanges occurred. Yet the medical commitment to healing remained paramount, a testament to the American military's attempt to maintain humanitarian principles amid the brutality of global conflict. By 1944, as waves of wounded German officers arrived in American military hospitals, a peculiar transformation began to take place. The rigid barriers of wartime hostility gradually gave way to something more fundamental, a recognition of shared humanity in the sterile confines of recovery wards. They expected to be treated like enemies, recalled Lieutenant Martha Granger, a Red Cross nurse who served at the 121st Evacuation Hospital in France. The first German officer I treated, a Luftwaffe captain with severe burns, flinched when I approached him. When I simply cleaned his wounds with the same care I'd give any patient, the surprise in his eyes was unmistakable. This dynamic repeated across hundreds of military hospitals. German officers, raised in the Nazi ideology of racial superiority and fed propaganda about American barbarism, found themselves confronted with professional medical care that contradicted everything they'd been taught to expect. Hospital logs from facilities in England, France, and later Germany itself tell a compelling story through their mundane medical notations. A wounded Oberleutnant from the 352nd Infantry Division, captured during the Normandy campaign, arrived expecting mistreatment. 3 weeks later, hospital records documented his assistance in translating for newly arrived German patients. Nurses' diaries and letters home reveal the complex emotional landscape they navigated. Today, I changed bandages for 3 Americans and 2 Germans, all with similar shrapnel wounds, wrote Nurse Catherine Dempsey to her sister in 1945. Sometimes I remember what these men might have done to our boys, and my hands want to shake. But then I look at the wound, not the uniform, and I'm just a nurse again. This professional detachment wasn't always easy to maintain. Red Cross nurse Elizabeth Whitaker described the tension in a field hospital near Bastogne following the Battle of the Bulge. "We lost 17 American boys yesterday. Today, I'm treating the men who might have killed them. You do your job, but some nights you cry yourself to sleep." For many German officers, American medical care represented their first direct exposure to American values in action. Feldwebel Kurt Müller, a panzer officer captured with severe abdominal wounds near Aachen, wrote in his post-war memoir, "They wheeled an American sergeant into the bed next to mine. He had lost both legs. The nurses treated us identically, same medications, same food, same care. This simple equality contradicted everything I had been told about Americans." The practical limitations of wartime medicine sometimes created ethical dilemmas. With limited blood supplies, medications and surgical teams, medical personnel faced impossible choices. Military directives initially gave priority to Allied wounded, but many doctors and nurses found ways to allocate resources based on medical urgency rather than uniform. Colonel Walter Mason, chief surgeon at the 35th Field Hospital, documented his approach. Triage is based on who can be saved and who cannot, not which side they fought for. This is not merely a moral position, but a practical one. A doctor who begins choosing patients based on politics becomes something other than a doctor. This medical neutrality had unexpected consequences. German officers, accustomed to a military culture that emphasized rank and hierarchy, found themselves in a system where their wounds, not their status, determined their treatment. For many, this experience prompted reflection on the societies they had served and fought against. As the war ended and recovery continued, unusual relationships formed. Hospital records show instances of German officers requesting to thank specific nurses before repatriation. Letters preserved in Red Cross archives reveal correspondence that continued years after the war, with former patients writing from Germany to express gratitude. One such letter, dated 1952, from a former Wehrmacht captain to nurse Sarah Calloway, reads, "You treated me when I could not move my legs after the shell hit our position near Remagen. I have walked for 5 years now, thanks to your care. My children know your name. Die." The rehabilitation process for severely wounded German officers often continued long after combat ended. American occupying forces established recovery centers in Germany, where protocols developed during the war were implemented by mixed teams of American and German medical personnel. This transfer of medical knowledge became part of the larger rebuilding effort. For the nurses who provided this care, their wartime experience influenced their entire careers. A 1955 survey of Red Cross nurses who served overseas found that 78% continued in medical fields after the war, with many citing their wartime experiences as transformative to their understanding of medicine's purpose. "I learned that good medicine transcends politics," reflected Captain Eleanor Richardson, who supervised a ward of wounded officers from both sides at a hospital in Belgium. "When you strip away the uniforms and the flags, you're left with men in pain who need help. That lesson served me for 40 years of nursing after the war." The legacy of this medical neutrality extended beyond individual experiences. The American military's approach to enemy wounded became codified in subsequent conflicts, influencing NATO medical protocols and international humanitarian standards. Training materials for military medical personnel now explicitly reference the WO2 experience as a model for ethical care under combat conditions. Perhaps the most telling evidence of impact comes from the German medical system itself. Post-war reforms in German military and civilian medical training incorporated principles observed in American field hospitals, creating a circularity to this exchange of humanitarian values. As one former patient, a German medical officer captured at Normandy, later wrote, "In American hands, I was not a Nazi, not an officer, not even German. I was simply a man who needed healing. This was their victory, more profound than any battle, to make an enemy feel human again."